Imagine for a moment that you are standing at a quiet dinner party, perhaps leaning against a kitchen counter with a glass of something unremarkable, when the conversation takes that inevitable turn toward the neighborhood real estate market or the incomprehensible run-up in a technology stock you have only vaguely heard mentioned on the news. The person across from you, a perfectly pleasant individual whose financial statements you have never seen, begins describing with a kind of weary nonchalance how the equity in their home has appreciated by an amount that exceeds your entire annual savings rate, or how a casual investment made during a moment of pandemic boredom has since tripled in value while they were busy doing something else entirely. And in that precise moment, even though your own balance sheet is technically sound, even though your emergency fund is fully stocked, and your debt-to-income ratio would make a credit union underwriter weep with joy, a strange and unsettling sensation begins to creep up from the base of your spine and settle somewhere just behind your sternum. You feel not secure, not prudent, but somehow poor. You have done everything the old books told you to do. You have accumulated the fiat currency of prudence, and yet standing in the reflected glow of someone else's leveraged asset appreciation, your own cash holdings suddenly feel less like a cushion and more like a heavy, inert weight that is actively holding you back from participation in the visible prosperity that seems to be happening to everyone else. This is not a miscalculation on a spreadsheet. It is a profound and deeply human psychological conflict known as the solvency paradox. The core of the solvency paradox rests on a fundamental misalignment between two different definitions of wealth that we rarely take the time to disentangle. On one side of the ledger, we have solvency, which is the quiet and unglamorous mathematical state of being able to meet one's obligations without resorting to fire sales or desperate borrowing. Solvency is a binary condition. You either have more assets than liabilities, or you do not. And cash is the purest, most undiluted form of solvency one can possess because it does not require the opinion of an appraiser or the liquidity of a secondary market to validate its existence. On the other side of the ledger, we have perceived prosperity, which is a social and psychological state entirely divorced from the balance sheet and instead tethered directly to the observable optics of consumption and, more potently, to the narrative of asset price appreciation. When you hold cash in an environment where the cost of borrowing is low and asset prices, whether equities, real estate, or even collectible sneakers, are rising at a velocity that outstrips wage growth, the cash holder is forced to watch the numerical value of their prudence remain stubbornly horizontal, while the leveraged speculator's net worth graph slants upward and to the right. The paradox is that the cash holder is objectively safer, possessing the ultimate option on future goods and services, as well as the ability to withstand a sudden loss of income without changing their life. Yet subjectively, they feel like they are losing a race they never consciously agreed to enter. The discomfort arises because the modern financial ecosystem, fueled by an era of cheap debt, has subtly shifted the goalposts from being unbreakable to being maximized, and the weight of cash does nothing to help you clear the bar of maximization. To understand why this feeling of loss is so visceral and difficult to shake, we must look not at the math of interest rates, but at the wiring of the human brain and the peculiar manner in which we encode social status. Our species evolved in environments where resources were tangible and scarcity was immediate. And as a result, the neural architecture that governs our sense of security is remarkably unsophisticated when it comes to abstract financial instruments like mortgage-backed securities or price-to-earnings ratios. There is a specific region of the brain, the anterior insula, which lights up with activity when we experience a loss. And fascinatingly, Neuroeconomic studies have demonstrated that the pain of a loss is approximately twice as powerful, psychologically, as the pleasure derived from an equivalent gain. This is the bedrock of loss aversion, and the solvency paradox exploits this asymmetry with cruel precision. When your neighbor's house value increases by $100,000, you do not experience that as a neutral data point. You experience it as a relative loss of status, which the brain interprets almost identically to having $100,000 physically removed from your own account. Furthermore, the human mind is not a passive calculator, but an active comparison engine, constantly scanning the social horizon for benchmarks to measure its own standing. In the absence of transparent balance sheets, we rely on proxies: the new car in the driveway, the remodeled kitchen, the casual mention of a brokerage account milestone, and we use these proxies to construct a mental ledger of who is winning and who is losing. Cash in a high-yield savings account provides no such proxy. It makes no noise, it requires no contractor's visit, and it offers no conversational flourish at a dinner party. It is the silent, invisible asset class that provides immense functional utility but zero social signaling value. The psychological burden of the solvency paradox, therefore, is the burden of feeling invisible while holding the only tool that can reliably navigate a crisis. You are standing still in a hurricane-proof bunker while everyone else is riding a hot air balloon made of adjustable-rate mortgages. And even though you know the physics of the situation is on your side, the view from the bunker is simply less compelling than the view from the sky. Let us now remove the social noise and the neural chemistry for a moment and examine the cold, dispassionate arithmetic that underpins this entire phenomenon, because the math is where the systemic trap is most clearly revealed. Consider two hypothetical individuals, Alice and Ben, operating in a financial environment that closely resembles the one we have occupied for much of the last 2 decades, an environment characterized by low nominal interest rates and robust asset inflation. Alice adheres to a strict, textbook definition of fiscal conservatism. She maintains a cash reserve of $100,000 in a savings vehicle yielding a modest 2% per annum. She has no debt beyond a manageable fixed-rate obligation. Ben, by contrast, operates with a higher degree of financial leverage. He possesses only $20,000 in liquid cash, but he has used debt to acquire a property valued at $500,000 with a 20% down payment, meaning he controls an asset worth $500,000 with $100,000 of his own equity. Now, let us introduce a market event, specifically a period of rapid asset inflation where the value of Ben's property increases by 10% over the course of a single year. Ben's asset appreciates by $50,000, which represents a 50% return on his initial equity investment of $100,000 when we ignore the carrying costs for the sake of clarity. Meanwhile, Alice's cash position has generated $2,000 in taxable interest. In this isolated snapshot of time, Ben's net worth has increased by an amount that dwarfs Alice's disciplined savings output, and the mathematical gap between them is so wide that Alice's prudence begins to look, from a purely numerical standpoint, like a strategic error. Alice has deployed her capital defensively, earning a risk-free return that fails to outpace the true rate of monetary debasement, while Ben has deployed his capital offensively, capturing the upside of an inflationary wave that he did not create but was positioned to surf. However, the solvency paradox is not merely about missing out on upside during the good times. Its true mathematical power lies in the asymmetric exposure to the subsequent downturn, which is a variable that the brain, dazzled by the 50% return, often fails to properly discount. If we extend the scenario and introduce a market correction that erases 10% of the property's value in the following year, Ben's net worth calculation changes dramatically. The asset falls from $550,000 to $495,000. Since Ben's debt remains fixed at $400,000, his equity is now compressed to $95,000. He has not only lost the paper gain of $50,000, but has also seen his original capital base of $100,000 erode by $5,000. And this calculation excludes the substantial transaction costs that would arise if liquidity became a necessity. Alice, on the other hand, still holds $102,000. She has not grown wealthy, but she has not been impoverished by the volatility of the market. She retains the full, unencumbered power of her cash to either meet emergency expenses without disruption or, and this is the crucial tactical advantage, to acquire assets from distressed sellers like Ben at a significant discount to their previous highs. The mathematics of leverage is a mathematics of magnification. It makes the good outcomes look spectacular and the bad outcomes look devastating. But the human mind, afflicted by recency bias and the vividness of the neighbor's new boat, systematically overweights the spectacle and underweights the devastation. The cash holder is not a passive observer losing the game. The cash holder is the only player at the table who is guaranteed to still have chips left when the music stops and the lights come on. And while that is not a glamorous role, it is the only role that permits the game to be continued under one's own terms. When we zoom out from the individual balance sheets of Alice and Ben and apply a systemic lens to this dynamic, we begin to see the solvency paradox not as a personal failing of discipline, but as a deliberate, engineered feature of the post-Bretton Woods monetary landscape. Since the final delinking of the dollar from gold in 1971, the global financial system has operated under a regime of pure fiat currency, where the supply of money is managed not by the physical constraints of mining, but by the policy objectives of central banking committees. In a fiat system, the preservation of cash value is no longer a passive, inherent property of the currency itself. It is an active, ongoing battle against a designed rate of erosion that economists euphemistically refer to as a healthy level of inflation. The explicit mandate of the Federal Reserve and its global counterparts includes maintaining a slow, steady decrease in the purchasing power of the currency units that savers hold dear, a policy intended to discourage the hoarding of cash and to stimulate the velocity of spending and investment. This policy creates a structural headwind for the saver, a kind of silent, invisible tax that is not itemized on any paycheck stub, but is deducted nonetheless from the future purchasing power of every dollar left idle. In this environment, cash is no longer a store of value in the classical sense. It is a depreciating asset with a negative real yield, and the act of holding it becomes an act of quiet defiance against the gravitational pull of the central bank's inflation target. The systemic consequence of this engineered erosion is the mass migration of capital out of savings accounts and into risk assets, a migration that has been the primary driver of the 4-decade bull market in both stocks and real estate. When money is cheap to borrow and the alternative is a guaranteed loss of 2 to 3% per year to inflation, the rational actor is incentivized to become Ben, to take on leverage and chase the capital appreciation that Alice is missing. The system does not reward the prudent cash holder, it taxes them, and then it celebrates the paper wealth of the leveraged speculator as evidence of economic vitality. This is the great systemic zoom out. The solvency paradox is not a glitch in your personal financial psychology. It is the intended, predictable outcome of a monetary architecture designed to penalize inaction and reward the assumption of financial risk, regardless of the long-term fragility that such an architecture necessarily accumulates beneath the surface. Given this understanding of both the internal psychological landscape and the external systemic forces at play, The only viable path through the solvency paradox involves a deliberate shift in identity, a conscious redefinition of what cash represents and what purpose it serves within the architecture of a life well lived. You must stop viewing your cash position as a sleepy, underperforming asset class that is failing to keep pace with a leveraged benchmark and begin viewing it for what it truly is, a stored reservoir of personal sovereignty and strategic option value. Cash is the only financial instrument that provides frictionless, immediate agency over your own time and decisions. It is the asset that allows you to tolerate a toxic work environment for exactly 0 additional days, because you know the rent is covered for the next 2 years. It is the asset that allows you to negotiate the purchase of a used car with a private seller without needing to ask permission from a bank's underwriting algorithm. It is the asset that, in the throes of a broad market liquidation when margin calls are cascading through the brokerage accounts of the over-leveraged, allows you to acquire productive assets, shares of profitable companies, income-generating real estate, even the specialized tools of your own trade, at valuations that will not be seen again for a generation. This is not a passive, defensive posture. It is an aggressive, offensive posture disguised as patience. The identity shift required is the shift from being a spectator of asset prices to being a steward of dry powder. The discomfort you feel when you hear about someone else's leveraged gains is the sound of your ego wrestling with the loss of relative status. And the solution is not to join the leverage party at the top of the cycle, but to reframe the value of your position entirely. You are not losing the race to maximize net worth on a nominal chart that does not account for risk-adjusted returns. You are simply running a different race entirely, a race measured not in the height of the peak, but in the depth of the valley you are prepared to cross without breaking stride. The moment you stop comparing the yield on your cash to the return on someone else's debt-fueled speculation and start measuring it by the amount of uncompromised sleep it affords you and the breadth of opportunities it keeps open, the paradox begins to dissolve and the true, immense power of solvency reveals itself. In the final analysis, the feeling that cash is losing is an illusion generated by a specific temporary convergence of monetary policy and social comparison bias. The history of financial markets is a long and repetitive record of liquidity events, of moments when the tide recedes and reveals precisely who has been swimming without a suit, and those moments arrive with a regularity that is as predictable as the changing of the seasons, yet as surprising as a thief in the night to those who have convinced themselves that this time the cycle has been abolished. The cash holder, the one who has felt the quiet sting of the solvency paradox for months or even years, is not the victim of this eventual reckoning, but its quiet, prepared beneficiary. There is a profound and enduring peace that settles over the mind when one finally accepts that it is not necessary to capture every single percentage point of upside in a speculative mania, that it is permissible to watch a portion of the market's gains pass by while remaining fully intact and fully liquid. The goal of a financial life is not to die with the highest possible number on a brokerage statement. The goal is to navigate the uncertain terrain between now and then with a minimum of anxiety and a maximum of agency. Solvency, in its purest form, is the foundation upon which that agency is built. It is the silent, invisible bedrock that allows you to absorb the shocks of a volatile world without fracturing your plans or compromising your values. The noise of the leveraged world will continue to rise and fall. The dinner party conversations will continue to ebb and flow with tales of valuation and appreciation. But once you have made the identity shift, once you truly understand the function of the dry powder in your possession, the sound of that noise becomes just that: background static, irrelevant to the quiet, durable, and sovereign architecture of your own financial life.